I want you to think about the last time money solved a problem for you. Really think about it. Not the bill you paid, not the emergency you covered. I mean, the last time having more money made you feel better and stayed that way. If you're struggling to remember, that's not an accident. There is a mechanism in your brain, documented, measurable, clinically observable, that guarantees you will adapt to every financial upgrade you ever achieve. More money, same baseline, new comparison, same anxiety. The number changes, the brain does not. And the cruelest part, the mechanism accelerates. The more you earn, the faster you recalibrate. The faster you recalibrate, the shorter the window of relief. The shorter the window, the more urgently you reach for the next level. This is not a character flaw. This is neuroscience operating exactly as designed. But if you don't understand what's happening inside your brain at each rung of the financial ladder, you will spend your entire life climbing something that has no top, and never understand why you feel just as hollow at 500k as you did at 50k. I'm going to walk you through it, level by level. Sit down. I'm Sloan Reed. 8 years as a licensed clinical psychologist, most of which I spent watching people trade one form of financial suffering for a more expensive one. This channel is where I document what I actually saw in that room. Subscribe if you've ever hit a financial milestone and felt inexplicably worse. Before we go level by level, you need one concept. Everything else is built on it: hedonic adaptation. The clinical definition: the human tendency to return to a relatively stable level of happiness despite major positive or negative events. In plain language, your brain treats pleasure like a thermostat. No matter how high you turn it up, it adjusts the baseline and calls that the new normal. This isn't a theory. It's been replicated in lottery winners, in people who received sudden inheritances, in executives who crossed the 7-figure threshold. The research is consistent and blunt. The emotional benefit of a significant financial gain typically fades within 6 months to 2 years. After that, the person reports subjective well-being approximately equal to what they reported before the gain. You got the thing. Your brain said acknowledged, filed, new baseline established. What's next? Now add reference point displacement, the second mechanism. Your brain doesn't evaluate your wealth in absolute terms. It evaluates it relative to a reference group. And that reference group shifts with every level you reach. At 60k a year, you compare yourself to people at 80k. At 200k, you compare to 350k. At one net worth, the comparison is 3 manners. The goalposts are not static. They are attached to you. These two mechanisms together produce what I call the financial treadmill. You run harder, you cover more ground, and you stay in exactly the same place emotionally. This is what we're studying today, level by level. Level 1, $0 to 30k, survival mode and the neurochemistry of scarcity. At this level, the brain is not thinking about wealth. It is thinking about threat. The prefrontal cortex, the executive decision-making center, is operating under chronic cortisol load. When income doesn't reliably cover basic needs, the stress response doesn't turn off. It becomes ambient, background. A permanent low-frequency alarm that shapes every financial decision made from this state. Here's what that looks like behaviorally. Short-term thinking dominates. Not because the person is stupid or impulsive, because the nervous system has correctly identified that the long term is not the immediate problem. The immediate problem is the next 72 hours. Planning for retirement when you don't know if rent is covered is not irrational, it is accurate. But here's the clinical complication. The scarcity mindset that develops at this level doesn't automatically dissolve when income increases. It leaves a residue. I have worked with patients earning 180k a year who still made decisions from a 28k nervous system, hoarding, avoiding, flinching at purchases that were objectively affordable. The brain learned to be scared, and brains that learn to be scared are not impressed by bank balances. The primary emotional experience at this level is not depression, which is what people assume. It is hypervigilance, the constant scanning, the mental energy that goes into tracking every small transaction, every unexpected expense, every margin between what came in and what went out. That is not a lifestyle. That is a symptom of a system under sustained load. Level 2, 30k to 75k, the illusion of relief. Something shifts at this level. The acute survival threat softens. Bills get paid with less panic. There's occasionally money left over, and for a window, 3 months, 6 months, maybe a year, something that feels like relief arrives. This is the hedonic adaptation honeymoon, and it is brief, because what happens next is reference point displacement, phase 1. You are no longer comparing yourself to the person who was drowning. You are now comparing yourself to the person one step ahead. The co-worker with the nicer apartment, the friend who just bought a car, the couple whose vacation photos arrived in your feed at the exact moment you were calculating whether you could afford a weekend trip. The relief window closes, the new baseline installs, and the anxiety returns, different in content, identical in intensity. At this level, the dominant psychological pattern is comparison fatigue. You are earning enough to be aware of how much more there is to earn. You are no longer in survival mode, but you are not in security mode either. You are in the gap, a specific kind of financial purgatory that feels more uncomfortable than scarcity in some ways, because at least scarcity had a clear enemy. Here, the enemy is invisible. It's just the persistent feeling that you should be further along. This is not a money problem. It's a reference point problem wearing a money problem's clothes. Level 3, 75k to 150k, the comfort trap. At this level, something more interesting happens. Objective quality of life has improved measurably. Research on income and well-being consistently identifies this range as where the basic stress of scarcity curve begins to flatten. The lights stay on. Medical emergencies don't automatically become financial crises. There is discretionary income, and the brain, freed from acute threat, begins a new project: identity construction through consumption. Because here's what nobody tells you about reaching financial comfort. The question that scarcity was suppressing, who am I and does that matter, now surfaces. And the culture has a very clean, very expensive answer ready. Your identity is purchasable. The car signals something, the neighborhood signals something, the restaurant signals something. The vacation destination signals something. At 100k, you are no longer buying things. You are buying the story those things tell about you. I'm not moralizing, I am diagnosing. The clinical pattern at this level is what I call aspirational enmeshment, a state where your sense of self becomes entangled with your consumption level in ways that make any financial constraint feel like an identity threat rather than a budget issue. A spending cut is not inconvenient, it is destabilizing, because the spending wasn't just spending, it was self-definition. The hedonic adaptation here is particularly insidious because it happens at the level of identity, not just comfort. You don't just adapt to the lifestyle, you become the lifestyle. And then the lifestyle has to keep expanding to maintain the self. Level 4, 150k to 400k, the high earner's invisible suffering. This is the level that produces the most confused patients, because people at this level are, by most objective measurements, doing extraordinarily well. They are in the top tier of household income in nearly every developed country. They have options most people never access. And yet the clinical presentation, the thing they come in describing, is a version of the same sentence I have heard at every level. I thought I'd feel different by now. Be honest, with me, with yourself. Pick one. The reference point at this level has shifted to the ultra-high income cohort. Not to peers who are doing well, to the genuinely wealthy. The 400k earner is now acutely aware of what too knowledge looks like because it surrounds them in the neighborhoods, the restaurants, the social circles that their income has given them access to. They are inside the room now. And inside the room, they are still the poorest person in it. The psychological term for this is relative deprivation, the experience of feeling poor in relation to the reference group, regardless of absolute income. It produces real cognitive and emotional effects, real dissatisfaction, real anxiety. That is not irrational. That is the reference point mechanism doing its job. But here is the clinical problem with this level specifically. The earning capacity required to reach 150k, 400k typically involves significant lifestyle costs, long hours, cognitive overload, deferred relationships, deferred health, deferred everything. The salary is compensation for something. And often what it's compensating for is the very things money was supposed to buy: time, presence, ease. This isn't a money problem, it's a dysregulation problem wearing an impressive income's clothes. Level 5, 400k to 1 million annual, under 3 million, net worth, the threshold delusion. There is a number that lives in the minds of people at this level, a specific threshold. A line they believe, with genuine conviction, will change things once crossed. The number varies by person. For some, it's the first million. For others, it's 3 million. For some, it's an annual income that rounds to a clean, impressive figure. The specific number is almost irrelevant. What matters is the psychological function it's performing. The threshold delusion is the belief that a specific financial milestone will produce a qualitative shift in subjective experience. Not just more comfort, but a fundamentally different relationship with security, identity, and anxiety. I'm going to say something nobody has said to you. The threshold delusion is not a mistake. It is a coping mechanism. The belief that a specific number will finally fix the underlying emotional equation is what makes the work of reaching that number feel meaningful. If you knew consciously that crossing the threshold would simply install a new, higher threshold, you might not be able to sustain the effort required to get there. The delusion is functional. It is also, eventually, the thing that breaks people, because the moment of crossing a threshold that was supposed to change everything and finding that everything is more or less the same, just with better furniture, is one of the more disorienting experiences I have witnessed in clinical practice. The person does not feel relieved, they feel cheated. And then, immediately, they identify the next threshold. The hedonic adaptation cycle at this level has now been repeated enough times that the person is beginning to recognize it. But recognition and interruption are different skills. And most people, by this point, have far more practice running the cycle than stopping it. Level 6, 1M plus A, net worth, the psychology of enough that never arrives. Something shifts at this level that is genuinely different from the levels below. The practical stress of financial insecurity is largely gone. Emergencies are absorbed. Retirement is not a question mark. The baseline needs that were generating cortisol at level 1 are covered, completely and reliably. And yet, the clinical literature on high net worth individuals consistently identifies something unexpected. Above a certain threshold of objective security, wealth anxiety doesn't disappear, it transforms. It becomes less about survival and more about meaning, about whether the accumulation of all this was for something, about whether the trade-offs were worth it, about who you are when you remove the financial achievement from the identity. The reference point at this level has often expanded to include the ultra-wealthy, the 10 millionaires, 50 millionaires, 100 millionaires cohort. And the person who has 1.5 millionaires in assets looks at that cohort and does not feel wealthy. They feel proximate to wealth, which psychologically is different in important ways. There is also a specific pattern I observed in patients at this level that I want to name precisely. The accumulation continues even when it has stopped being functionally necessary. Not because the person is greedy. In the clinical sense, greed implies desire. This is something quieter. This is the machine running after the original reason for the machine has resolved. The financial behavior was built as a response to a psychological need: security, control, identity, relief. The need was real, the behavior worked up to a point. But the behavior became habitual before the need was examined, and now the behavior continues, automated, even in the absence of the original trigger. Your bank account is a receipt for your beliefs. And at this level, some of those beliefs are still running on a nervous system that formed at level 1. Level 7, 3 omninon to 10 irons, when the scoreboard becomes the problem. At this level, the psychological landscape shifts again, and in ways that are rarely discussed. The practical question of wealth has been resolved. The question that remains is almost purely psychological. What does the number mean? What is it for? What am I for now that the primary organizing project of my adult life, financial achievement, has been substantially completed? This is the level where the scoreboard becomes the problem. Because money, in addition to everything else it is a scoreboard. It is measurable. It tells you at any moment exactly how you're doing relative to the objective. And for people who built their identity around financial achievement, which is a significant proportion of people who reach this level, the removal of a meaningful scoreboard is not liberation. It is disorientation. The reference point displacement at this level becomes almost abstract. The comparison is no longer to neighbors or colleagues. It's to a cultural idea of what constitutes real wealth, a number that exists primarily in the media, in the observable behavior of the ultra-rich, in the private knowledge that 10 minutters is different from 5 menlondons in ways that aren't entirely rational but feel important. The clinical pattern I observed most consistently at this level was not depression, not anxiety in the traditional sense, but a specific kind of purposelessness. A flatness. The drive that had been so reliably available for decades had been fueled in part by the belief that there was a destination. And now the person was at something close to the destination. And the destination looked, from the inside, remarkably like everywhere else. Hedonic adaptation does not make exceptions for large numbers. What you're actually solving for, I want to be precise about what I'm not saying. I am not saying money doesn't matter. It matters enormously, particularly at the lower levels, where the absence of it produces genuine suffering that is not primarily psychological. It is material. Telling someone at 20K a year that their suffering is a mindset problem is not a diagnosis. It is a cruelty. What I am saying is that the mechanism of adaptation means that financial progress, on its own, does not produce the psychological outcomes most people are pursuing when they pursue financial progress. Security, ease, the feeling of enough, identity stability, relief from comparison, satisfaction that stays. None of those are financial products. All of them are psychological ones, and they cannot be purchased at any level because the brain that would receive them recalibrates before the deposit clears. So, what do you do with that? The first thing is the hardest. You stop treating the next level as the solution to what the current level didn't fix. This sounds obvious. It is, in practice, one of the most difficult psychological interventions I know, because the reference point mechanism is not conscious. It doesn't announce itself. It just quietly moves the goalposts and lets you believe the problem is still the distance. The second thing is to identify, with clinical honesty, what emotional need the financial goal is actually serving. Not the practical need. I know what that is, the emotional one. Is it safety, validation, control? The suspension of a specific comparison? The silencing of a specific voice from childhood? Because that need is real, and it deserves a real solution, not a financial proxy that will work for 6 months and then require upgrading. The third thing, and I say this as someone who spent 8 years watching people not do it, is to take seriously the research on what actually correlates with stable subjective well-being across income levels. It is not income above a certain threshold. It is the quality of relationships, the presence of meaning in daily activity, the capacity to tolerate uncertainty without reaching for a financial escape hatch. None of those are available for purchase. The treadmill doesn't have an off switch, but it has a pause. And in the pause, the question you've been running from has been waiting, patiently, for the entire time. What would you do with enough if you believed you already had it? If you've ever crossed a threshold you were supposed to feel it, and felt instead the quiet arrival of the next threshold. That's not failure, that's the mechanism. And mechanisms can be understood. Subscribe. The next video goes somewhere adjacent to this and considerably less comfortable. If you're at a specific level right now and the description landed harder than you expected, leave it in the comments, not the number, the feeling. That's what we're actually studying here,